Pretty much you were the only Republican candidate to have voted against the war in Iraq. You also advocated bringing back U.S. troops from not just Iraq and Afghanistan, but also Korea and from Germany. What would be the impact of such a move on the global conflicts that have been taking place if the U.S. pulled away from its allies in such a way?
Well, I think the world would be much more peaceful, and we certainly would have a healthier economy because we would be saving a lot of money. But the resolutions of these problems would be done in the region rather than with us interfering. So I think it would be much better. And I don't accept the term that what I advocate is isolationism, because I may want to bring our troops home, but the last thing I want to do is isolate ourselves from the world, because I believe we should be a nation that's open, that we should welcome visitors. We should welcome trade and exchange of ideas. So it's the opposite. There are some in this country who would advocate high tariffs and high isolationism and the same foreign policy of less intervention. But I don't advocate that. Mine is free trade and freer travel and negotiations before we fight with people. And I think that would be helpful to everybody, not just us. I think it would be a move toward peace in the world rather than war.
But could it be a true partner with its allies around the world if it pulls out of NATO and out of the United Nations, as you've advocated, sir?
Well, you can be friends with everybody. I think it's a detriment to us to be in NATO, because that certainly doesn't help us with our relationships with Russia. I mean, fortunately, you know, the plan to put those anti-ballistic missiles right on Russia's doorstep, that's been tabled, even though they're going to replace it with something else. So no, we wouldn't have to use NATO. NATO's involved in Afghanistan, and all that happens is we become NATO. We become the United Nations. We have the most money and the most weapons, so we take over those organizations, and I think that makes us less popular in the world. And I think that kind of a policy, especially when we use military might and intimidation, I think that raises the chance that we will be attacked by those who grow to hate us. And this is the main reason that I think we should reconsider our foreign policy.
Well, so, you know, we had an email that came in from Norway, from Jonas Abraham Lind, who wrote in saying, "The Campaign for Liberty has hundreds of members in Europe, including my country, Norway, which testifies to the great success of your recent presidential campaign. If international support and interest in your message continues its momentum, will you appeal more to your like-minded foreigners, or will you persist on focusing solely on the American people?"
I do both. I will continue to work within the system and where I live and where I work in the Congress. And if others notice it and they're encouraged, I'd be very delighted and excited about it, because we do communicate with a lot of people around the world. And I think true revolutions are pervasive. You know, if we have a revolutionary change in this country, it's not going to be the Republican Party. The ideas will influence the Democrats as well. So the ideas of socialism and Keynesianism and intervention and central banking, all these things that we've lived with for 100 years, they have been worldwide. But there are major changes occurring. So if the freedom movement is worth its salt, which I obviously think it is, it will be worldwide. So I'm delighted when I hear that we have supporters around the world who are interested in hearing this message.
Now, we had an email question that came in from Washington, D.C. here in the USA, from Lincoln Jaser. This one says, "In a time when we are the leaders of a global community, doesn't Representative Paul think it would make the American people and the world less safe if we withdrew from any international diplomacy? Doesn't he think this would embolden countries like Iran and North Korea?"
Well, I think the opposite. I think we'll be more safe. We'll be more secure financially, and we would be trying to influence people by setting a good standard. And I think it would diminish the threat of terrorist attack in this country. If you think of the power and scope of the Soviet system, and I'm not comparing our system to theirs, but at least they had an empire. But it ended. It ended for financial reasons. They couldn't afford it anymore. Most empires end for financial reasons. So I would say that we'd all be better off, but I do not. I think we'd be much safer by us not having these military bases. We would resent it. Americans would be so resentful if anybody thought they could put military bases on our soil, or heaven forbid somebody drops a bomb, just to think about our reaction on 9/11. But we drop bombs on people without thinking too much. I mean, just like right now, our CIA is used to drop bombs with drones in Pakistan, and innocent people can get killed. Innocent people being killed make people angry, and rightfully so. So I would say that we would be much safer with a different foreign policy.
Well, of course, there are those who say that, who support President Obama, who say that he's having to unravel 8 years of the Bush administration's policies, which were less engaging, and that the Obama administration is at least trying to engage. I mean, do you support that move to try to at least speak to some of those who have been labeled enemies throughout the last decade?
Yes, and that's what I say. I think the rhetoric and the tone is different. I think right now, of course, we're supposed to talk with the Iranians about their nuclear program on October 1st. But at the same time, all of a sudden, there was a big concern expressed here in Pittsburgh and so-called new information, which I didn't believe it was new. So there's a conflict within the administration and outside the administration agitating, don't talk to them. They're trying to break those talks up. But I would agree with you that the fact that he's at least having some overtures toward talking with the Iranians, I think that is very, very good, and I encourage it.
Presumably, so you don't think that President Obama is has become as much of a neocon as the former President George W. Bush, as you once said, then?
No, not as much, but he's still influenced that way. If he didn't endorse a lot of neocon philosophy, he wouldn't be talking the way he is about Afghanistan. He wants more troops over there. He's always said that. There's a big argument how many troops are going to be sent and how much NATO allies will contribute. No, he's still influenced. He's a long way from a constitutional, non-interventionist foreign policy, which I advocate.
You know, it's interesting. You've said that that the U.S. money spent, the tremendous amounts of money spent by the U.S. on fighting the so-called war on drugs has been largely wasted, or at least you've spoken out against the policy. What would you see as a viable alternative to that trying to fight drugs with the way the administration has tried?
Well, I would probably look at and study what prohibition does, and we've had a tremendous lesson learned in the early part of the last century when the American people believed that alcohol was very bad, and they were well motivated, but they respected the Constitution back then. They amended the Constitution and said no more alcohol, and then they found out that it didn't stop people from drinking. The alcohol they drank was much more dangerous, and it was delivered by crime syndicates. So the American people repealed the prohibition. And I think that's what we should do. The prohibitions against drug usage should be a medical problem. We treat alcoholism and the use of alcohol as a medical problem, and I think people who use drugs use them foolishly, and they're very, very dangerous. We shouldn't do it, but it's also done personally, and if the person drinks alcohol today, you know, we put them in jail if they've caused an accident. But the same way with drugs, we should punish people anytime they cause injury and harm. But the prohibition of substances is something way beyond. Unless you're a believer in authoritarian government, the government should crack down on personal habits, and I don't buy that. People should make their own decisions. If they make a mistake, they should suffer their own consequences. But the complications from prohibition against certain substances is much worse than allowing people to make their own choices. So the war on drugs has been a total failure, and it is, you know, it even affects our foreign policies indirectly. So
you mentioned the Constitution a couple of times. You, of course, are one of those well, there are a few like you in the government in the U.S. who have the level of experience you do. Based on what you've seen, how things have changed, do you feel the Constitution, the American Constitution, has remained intact? Is it serving its purpose?
No, not really. Most members of Congress believe they do their very best. They just interpret it differently, because we've had quite a few generations now teach our young people that interpreting the Constitution is flexible. It should be modernized. They don't say amend it if you want to change it. They say, well, you can interpret certain provisions of the Constitution differently, and therefore you do have the authority. Some even argue that if the Constitution doesn't prohibit something, you're allowed to do it, and that's not the way it's written. The Constitution is written explicitly to say you can't do anything, that is the U.S. government, unless the Constitution gives you direct authority to do it. So they misinterpret it, and they don't lose any sleep over it. So once again, it's an educational effort to understand what our system is all about and why limited government and following the rule of law is so important.